I played the Surge years ago, but I never really finished it. I stopped at the big sister boss and thought, fuck it, this game isn't worth beating. Reasoning with myself that
This is not okay.
I came back to it now in 2023 with a more mature and relaxed mindset, and now I've done a full 180 with what I think of the game. It's not the best Souls-like out there by a long shot, but it certainly hooked me enough to finish the game and even keep me going through to NG+. Today, we'll be talking about the Surge's good and bad points and find out, is it worth playing in 2023? The first thing I have to mention is that before getting deep enough in the game, I only thought of the Surge as a sci-fi version of Dark Souls and nothing more. While it certainly is heavily inspired by the Souls games, it has its own gimmicks to differentiate itself among the rest and be its own thing. Let me explain. The most comparable thing you see in Souls-like games is their slow, methodical combat. Everything you see in other games, the Surge has it as well. But what the Surge has over others is that you can specifically target the limbs of enemies and dismember them. Yup, that's right, you can chop off the limbs of enemies and even grab the gear equipped on that limb. This works on bosses too, by the way, but we'll get into that later. Additionally, the Surge doesn't use the traditional light and heavy attacks and opts for a horizontal and vertical attacks approach to complement the targetable limbs aspect of combat. Your attacks when targeting a right limb of an enemy will differ slightly than when targeting a left limb or their head. While there are no traditional heavy attacks, the Surge instead encourages players to string attacks into combos that usually end in what most people would call a heavy attack. No matter what attacks you input to combo, these will flow seamlessly in combat and also change slightly depending on what limb you're attacking. This really adds to the depth of combat, as some combos will be better than others in certain situations. And now, the dismemberment part of combat. While in combat, you'll realize that hitting enemies will grant you energy. When it reaches a certain threshold, and you've dealt enough damage to the enemy's limb and total health, you'll be given a prompt to do an execute move that results in a short slow motion sequence where you cut that limb off. What's interesting about this is that you get any piece of armor that the enemy was wearing on that limb as crafting schematics. If the limb you are targeting was holding the enemy's weapon, you will also get the weapon itself, provided you don't already have it. This adds another layer into combat as you choose whether to attack the armored parts to get their weapon, armor, or crafting materials, or non-armored parts for more health and stagger damage. Lastly, dismembering enemies one after another increases your multiplier on how much tech scrap you get per kill. This multiplier resets when you use a medbay, this game's version of bonfires, or when you die. This essentially gives you the opportunity to farm tech scrap in low-level areas. Overall, the game's combat feels smooth, polished, and never felt dull. Now that we've talked about how the Surge's gameplay differentiates itself from most Souls-likes, I want to dive deeper into what made the game so interesting to me, as someone who generally doesn't like the sci-fi setting that much compared to fantasy. The introductory cutscene of the game introduces the Earth in a somewhat failing state, as if humans have gone past the point of no return and are in fear of dying out. It's actually an advertisement by Creo introducing their Project Resolve and how it's supposed to heal the planet and save mankind. In line with this, Creo has invented exosuits that could be modified to make work easier for humans and to essentially contribute to human evolution. It also allows for PWDs to come back into the workforce and contribute to the change Creo is supposedly making. Why does this matter? Well, because the main character, Warren, is a paraplegic. After the advertisement ends, the screen zooms out to reveal our protagonist pressing the Join Now button to enter Creo's exosuit program. The game gives us control of Warren, letting it sink in that he's a normal guy in a wheelchair, looking to get his legs back. All seems normal, but there's a hint that says something's not right. There are fully armed security forces blocking certain pathways, and there's nobody else on the station. You make your way through registration. Here the game gives you two options: the quick and agile Lynx rig or the heavy-duty Rhino rig. It gives a sense of you choosing your starting class, but whatever you choose essentially doesn't matter, and we'll see why later. You choose a rig and you move on to the installation of the suit. Something goes wrong. You're not sedated, and you're forced to go through the process wide awake. You see the drilling of bolts and screws and piercing of needles on your skin and muscle. You scream in pain, but it's all in vain as you're strapped to the chair, and at the end, a microchip is inserted into your skull. You black out. You wake up in a scrapyard with a drone tugging on your leg, supposedly trying to remove your exosuit. Kicking it away, you realize you can move your legs now and stand up. The game starts, and the tutorial begins. Movement is smooth and responsive, and the tutorial is reminiscent of a traditional Souls game tutorial, making it well integrated into the first area of the game. Everything from combat to inventory and the med bay is explained, and I found no trouble following the tutorial whatsoever. The game has no stats, but it does have implants. Implants are basically upgrades you equip into your rig that gives you bonuses like extra health, stamina, and energy, or even injectables that heal, recover stamina, or even slow down time. How do you equip implants? Some implants can be swapped whenever you want from the menu, but most implants require you to be using a med bay to install and remove them. Your rig has a maximum power stat that increases every time you level up. You level up by spending tech scrap like you would traditional Souls in Souls games. This maximum power number dictates what implants you can equip, since implants will require a certain amount of energy from your suit when equipped. If implants are the main source of creating your build in the game, what are the armor pieces for? Well, armor sets are divided into 3 types: Operator, light armor; Sentinel, medium armor; and Goliath, heavy armor. These give different buffs and negative effects that are generally based on their type and give a bonus buff when equipping the whole set. You can mix and match armor pieces, but I never really tried if there are any benefits to doing this. I didn't think I'd enjoy a progression system that didn't involve leveling up stats in a Souls-like game, but with the Surge, I did. You want more health? Install more health implants. Want more healing potions? Install more healing potion implants. Leveling up is a means for you to customize stats rather than it being the main way of building your stats, and I'm all for it. Exploration in the game is very cookie-cutter Souls game style. Large areas with enemies spread around and tons of nooks and crannies to explore that reward you with items and collectibles. The infamous "cannot be opened from this side" doors are also present here. And let me tell you that this game has a lot of alternate routes integrated into each area. Exploring was really a joy because I found the size of the levels to be perfect, and I'd always find a new route back to the med bay whenever I thought I got too far. There's no fast travel in this game, and that's probably where the exploration's weak point lies: the backtracking. On the other side of this coin, backtracking is usually never a bore, since the game's enemy types and layout change at multiple parts of the game, so you'll always stay on your toes as you explore areas you've already visited. Speaking of enemy types, you'll realize that most of the enemies in the game consist of humanoid types with varying weapons and armor equipped. This would usually be a red flag for me, but I noticed that every time enemies respawn, enemy armor pieces are randomized, meaning if an enemy you defeated had body armor, the next time it spawns, it may not have body armor and instead have head armor instead. While the weapons don't change, the juggling of enemy armor pieces at least made me change my approach to each enemy slightly. Enemy movesets depend on what weapon they use and stay unaffected regardless of what enemy is using them, with a few exceptions in the late game. The most interesting part of the game for me was the bosses. The game has such unique bosses, and the limb targeting aspect of combat applies to most of them. There's a boss fight where you fight a firebug giant drone, which you see multiple times while exploring, which has multiple legs. You can attack these legs individually and even cut them off. Cut enough of them off and it moves to phase 2, where the remaining legs change movesets. You can choose to go directly for the boss's health or continue to cut off its legs to further reduce its moveset. The cherry on top with these boss fights are that at the end of the fight, you get their unique weapons. If you finish the fight in a certain way, like not cutting off all the legs of the firebug boss, you actually get an upgraded version of their weapon as a reward for finishing the fight in a hardcore manner. Honestly, the only bad thing about these bosses were that there weren't enough of them. There are only 5 bosses in the main game, and it takes a while to get to them during your first playthrough. I wish the base game had more bosses, since this is one of the reasons why I got so invested in the game. What's the other reason? Well, the game's story. In traditional Souls-like fashion, the game doesn't tell you the story outright. Good thing that the gameplay is a good enough reason to keep playing the game, since I know there are a lot of people that don't like this way of revealing the story. As you explore the game, you meet various NPCs that give little tidbits of lore around what happened at Creo and why everything's gone to shit. Most notable of these NPCs is Sally, someone you meet and communicate with in the mid-bay areas of the game. She essentially acts as a guide to tell you where to go next and prompts you to go to the executive area to free her as she's trapped up there. On your way there, you collect and discover audio logs of people that give further context to the events in the game, and these audio logs contain some really dark stuff. Once you get to meet Dr. Chavez, a researcher integral to the creation of Project Resolve, you find out that they discovered that Resolve is toxic to humans, and other researchers tried to come up with a better version of it, namely Project Utopia. The thing is, Project Utopia appears to be worse, using nanites as opposed to Resolve's chemical-based solution to try and counteract the effects of global warming. The nanites basically grew sentient and are now kind of like an Avengers-level threat during the events of the game. You're tasked with stopping its launch, which is the main driving force of the game. I love how the game turns from chill, mysterious, and unexciting to just completely dark at a certain point in the game. Audio logs of NPCs you've been following suddenly express feelings of hopelessness, defeat, betrayal, etc. You start second-guessing Sally's motives for directing you to the executive forum, and as you slowly piece together what Project Utopia is, you gain this sense of dread knowing that it may already be too late to stop what they've started. There may not be a linear experience to the storytelling, but what the game excels with this method is creating an atmosphere which fits the world perfectly and immerses you in the fictional lives of these NPCs and making you realize the scale of the threat presented. In the end, after defeating the game's best boss, narrative-wise, your worst fear comes to life as your best efforts to stop Project Utopia aren't enough and the rocket launches anyway. The game ends in one of two ways. The ending you get depends on a certain action you do, or not do, which is linked to Dr. Chavez's questline. To be honest, the difference isn't much and both essentially hint at a sequel, which we already have with The Surge 2. Of course, the game isn't perfect even with all the good points I've said about the game already. There's a weapon proficiency system that increases your effectiveness with a certain weapon type based on its level. You increase this by defeating enemies with that weapon type. For me, this discouraged the use of other weapons since the best weapons in the game highly scale with weapon proficiency, greatly affecting your DPS in the late game. I mean, why would I switch to a single rigged weapon type with 0 proficiency when I have my staff proficiency at level 20? They say they removed this in the second game, and I completely agree with that decision. There's also not that much variety in what you see in the levels. This is to be expected due to the setting of the game, but it all looks very industrial and monotone to me. There's a lot of black and gray in this game and not enough vibrant colors, but I can understand why the game looks like this enough to not complain about it too much. The game also has an NG Plus feature where they add new enemies in different parts of the map. These enemies have high level gear but don't respawn. They might even have a weapon you're meant to get later on in the game that you missed, which allows you to acquire it very early on. Everything else though remains unchanged. Overall, the game is great, and if you're a fan of Souls-likes, then this game is definitely up your alley. Is it worth playing in 2023, 6 years after its release? Definitely. I'm not a fan of sci-fi setting games, but this one got me good, and I'm excited for the time I get to play the sequel to see how they built on the good points of the first. This game has DLC which I never got to play, but they add a ton to gear options, bosses, and implants. Thanks for watching the video. Make sure to leave a like and consider subscribing if you like this type of content. Have a great day ahead.